Hello and welcome to Armchair Readings, read live on Twitch, 9 p.m. on a Monday. Links are below. Come and join us. A supernatural story for you. And tonight, I'm going to give you a content warning. I'm going to show you the front page of the book, and it does have a spider on it. So look away now. There it is. From the St. Michael 65 Great Spine Chillers book, The Spider Has Gone. Gibbet Lane by Anthony Gittins. They walked together down the road with a purposeful but laboured stride, which, in addition to their farcically large and elaborate rucksacks, every pastime has its panache, marked them as town dwellers on a weekend hike. Their movements and pace, schooled to a pavement scuttle, lacked rhythm. They fatigued themselves much more by swinging fast downhill than by plodding uphill, and their long periods of silence were due to this fatigue and not to any absorption or even interest in the scenery. Conclusive proof that they came from the noisome intestines of a large town was afforded by their pale faces and a complete ignorance of the purpose of gate fasteners. And, as they were in Surrey, where the country timidly begins south of the latitude through Guildford, and as they expected any and every farmhouse to supply them with tea, were quite willing to pay. And as they behaved with a transatlantic disregard for other people's property, it was evident that they were Londoners. The taller one, who had a wart, described by his mother as a birthmark and by his father as a damned pimple on his forehead, and a sheepish eyes, was a Mr. Gollan, aged 32, and he worked in Chancery Lane office of the Belladonna Insurance Company. His friend, Mr. Pounceby, aged 37, had a large head and a rather short haircut, and also worked in the Chancery Lane office of the Belladonna Insurance Company. They both had the unimpressionable and sceptical nature common to all insurance agents, and also that deficiency of imagination which is normal in businessmen. In fine, they were stolid creatures, material in outlook, daring jesters at the expense of the League of Nations. "Damned old mothers' meeting," Mr. Pounceby would say, no less daring in their censure of politicians. "Start every war, they do," Mr. Gollan would observe, and raucously contemptuous of the supernatural. "Ghosts, all bosh and eyewash," they would chorus disdainfully. It is particularly important to remember that they were so scornful about psychic phenomena. Had they been windy old men or neurotics or journalists, no genuine authority could have attached to this story of theirs. They had just, for the fourth time, unsuccessfully requested tea at a farmhouse. "Frightfully unsociable people round here," remarked Mr. Pounceby, as they trudged on, their huge limp rucksacks likening them to parched camels searching for an oasis. "Yes, frightfully," agreed Mr. Gollan. "Dash it all, you'd think they'd be jolly glad to make a tanner out of 2 cups of tea. Or 2 cups of tea out of a tanner. I mean tannin," rejoined Mr. Pounceby wittily. "I wish I could think of things like that as quickly as you do, George," Mr. Gollan said with intense admiration. "You know, you ought to write a play. I'll bet you could do that Noel Coward sort of dialogue as easy as Pat." "Oh, I don't know," said the gratified Mr. Pounceby, desperately cranking his mind in the hope of churning out another witticism. But it was like winding an empty sausage machine. Nothing emerged. He did try a pun on Coward and Pat, but even in his own eyes it was a dismal failure, so he hastily revived their original topic. "No, they're not as hospitable as people in town, he declared, just as if he were in the habit of dropping into houses in, say, the Cromwell Road and offering the residents threepence for a cup of tea. "Hello, there's someone ahead, up by that signpost. We'll ask him where the nearest pub is." They covered the intervening distance in silence. The man, who stood near the old discoloured signpost, occasionally swiping with his stick at the long grass, had a pale oval face, with bright eyes set in dark pits, and a thin curved nose which came forth like an unexpected challenge from his meek and otherwise regular features. He was about 50, wore a brown tweed shooting hat, back to front, with a small feather in one side, very old breeches and dull green stockings, a soiled white cotton scarf tied round his neck and tucked into his faded yellow corduroy waistcoat, and comparatively new heather mixture Norfolk jacket. The clothes did not hang well on him. It was as if, at one time and another, he had been given each garment by a different employer, for they were oddly contrasted, and all of a better material than probably he himself could afford. Altogether, with his rough apparel and sensitive features, he cut an unusual figure. He might have been a poet forced to earn his living on the land, and would indeed have been less conspicuous at the Café Royal than he were here. Mr. Pounceby, however, was not of this opinion. "Typical countryman," he remarked as they approached. "Yes," agreed Mr. Gollan, wishing that he had been the first to make that astute observation. "Shall I ask him, or will you?" Mr. Pounceby said he would. He straightened his back and tried to look as if he had walked 30 miles that day and was enjoying it, whereas he had only walked 7 and was loathing it. "Which is the way to the nearest public house?" he called out. The man stopped swiping at the glass with his stick and looked at them. Before replying, he deftly decapitated a small clump of rushes. "There's one at Feldy," he called out. "Which way's that? Oh, I see. It's on the signpost," said Mr. Pounceby. "If you go by that signpost," rejoined the man, "it'll be the English Channel you'll reach before Feldy. It swings round with the wind, see?" He grasped it with one hand and twisted it. "Now, that's right." "Thanks," said Mr. Gollan. "Not that it'll help you any better even now to find Feldy," said the man, "if you're strange to these parts." He began chewing a reed. "I see you are," he added. This huffed Mr. Pounceby, although proud of being a townie, always hoped to pass unidentified as such in the country, because, as he candidly confessed, they'll do much more for you, you know, if they think you're one of their sort. Unfortunately, he always failed to pass as one of their sort, because he believed that because he believed that to do in Rome as the Romans do, it was only necessary to wear a toga and sandals. "Isn't it rather a waste of taxpayers' money," he said, "to put up signposts which are of no use?" "Squire's orders. Nothing to do with taxpayers," replied the man. "Very few people use this lane anyway." And in his tone there was something which implied that the lane was rarely frequented, not because it was out of the way, but because it had an unpleasant history. He threw away the reed he had been chewing and moved the post again until it was upright. Then he noted the shadow which it cast. The sun was disappearing behind a muddle of dark clouds, and the dim, attenuated shadow struck the base of an oak in the opposite hedge. 10 minutes to 5, he observed. "You've got about a mile and a half to go." "Well, thanks," said Mr. Gollan again, for he was no conversationalist at the best of times, and having noticed the lowering sky, he was anxious to reach the shelter before it rained. He shook his hands with the man and moved towards the lane, which was a little more than a path leading to Felday. Mr. Pounceby also awarded the stranger a handshake, and at the same time was about to express his thanks when, and Mr. Pounceby afterwards remained positive on this point, the man said, "I'll come some of the way with you." "Well, thanks very much," said Mr. Pounceby, and caught up with his friend Gollin, while the man fell into step on the outside of Mr. Pounceby. "There's a use for everything, you see," said the man. Gollin and Pounceby, appalled by the prospect of another mile and a half, had abruptly subsided into one of their periodic silences. Take that signpost. As a signpost, it's useless. It should say how far it is to Feldy. It should say that this lane's called Gibbet Lane. It should quite reasonably always point in the same direction. It doesn't do any of those things. But all the same, it's a pretty good sort of sundial. He spoke swiftly, smoothly, giving scant opportunity for question or comment. When poor old JC had such a terrible fright up here, over a year ago that was, I thought it was the signpost that did it. Until I got home I did. Anyway, JC's my dog, Red Setter. It does look a bit queer in this dull light, don't you think? Mr. Pounceby glanced back over his shoulder. "Come on," growled Mr. Gollin, who was concerned about the rapidly darkening sky. "Like a gallows, rather," added the man, without waiting for a reply. "Actually, there was a gallows there once. The last man they hanged on it was a farmer named Coulter, James Coulter. Case of wife murder. 2 hours after he was dead, they found he was innocent. The next morning, the gibbet was down. Struck by lightning, some said. And there were 6 people in the neighbourhood who swore they'd seen James Coulter during the night." He paused for a moment. Lowering the sky, the last pale strand of the sun disappeared, and a small, unexpected wind murmured in a requiem in the trees. Then there was silence. The man's voice became more subdued. "That's why this lane's called Gibbet Lane. Whatever people may say, there's something mightily queer about it. I never bring JC up here now, but I often wonder what he could tell about that afternoon he took fright up here. It was like this. We were walking together down this lane. JC was 2 or 3 yards in front of me. Mind you, he isn't a nervous dog, and never has been. But he suddenly stopped dead and looked round. His eyes were focused about where I was, but he didn't seem to see me. God only knows what did catch his eye, for I've never seen such fear in the look of beast or man as I did then. The hair on the back went straight up, and he began edging away, as if hell and all the devils were there. I clicked my finger 2 or 3 times and called out quietly, but it didn't have any effect. Then he let out a yell and bolted. My God, now he bolted. He went slap down the lane faster than a greyhound would have done, howling all the way. The man nodded to where the gable of the farmhouse was visible. The window under the gable faced up the lane, which was dead straight and for the most part hemmed in by high rocky banks, as if it had once been the bed of a stream. There was no grass, no plant life, no vegetation at all on either bank. It was a sombre gully, and the shadows were now huddling into the crannies and fissures of its barren sides. "That's where I used to live with my sister. It's empty now. My sister died in March. Well, JC was back there in a flash, and I jumped the gate into the yard before my sister had time to run downstairs and open it for him. You see, she'd only heard him coming, but had been looking out of her bedroom window. That's the one you can see from here, when he started behaving so queerly. She'd seen it all. A couple of minutes later, I got back, wondering whether that queer-looking signpost had anything to do with it, or whether the dog had seen something strange. It said that we're more susceptible than human beings to, well, anything psychic. They can sense the presence of death, too. Anyway, I asked my sister what her opinion was, and she said, he must have taken fright at some noise, if you'd been with him at the moment. But I was with him, I said, just behind him. With him? When he bolted? Yes, in fact, I was with him all the way down until he ran off like that. My sister looked at me rather curiously and asked if I'd been drinking. She knew very well, though, that I never do drink, and I told her so. She fixed her eyes very queerly on me then. I saw you come some of the way down, she said. Then I attended to something in the room, and when I looked out again, Dick, I'm frightened, she said suddenly, and caught hold of my arm. You're telling me the truth, aren't you? Swear to me you're in the lane when... Nancy, I said, I give you my oath that I was with the dog every step of the way till he bolted from me. Why do you ask? She went very white then, and I thought she was going to faint. I don't understand it, she cried. I could see every inch of that lane from my window, and as God's my witness, I swear there was not a soul in it when Jacy took fright. The dog was absolutely alone. You can imagine what a shock that gave me, continued the man after a moment's pause, for I remembered that the dog had been looking where I was, and yet, he said very slowly, there was something about me, shall I say, something in me, so horrible that it sent an animal half mad with fear. It's the sort of thing that can easily turn a man's reason, isn't it? If he thinks about it. Much. At this point, the man stopped abruptly, and Pounceby, more perturbed than he cared to show, realised the story had come to an end. He realised also, with genuine uneasiness, that they were now walking down the lane, the very lane where this peculiar incident had taken place. At that moment he wished he was miles from the spot. Subsequently, he wished most emphatically that he had never gone down the lane at all. It served him as a perennial topic of conversation, of course, but the whole of that afternoon's experience was one that he would never have voluntarily undergone again. What a remarkable thing, he said, stuttering, mastering his uneasiness. What's remarkable? Asked Mr. Gullen, speaking for the second time since leaving the signpost. They passed into the gloomy shadows formed by a dark conspiracy of elms in the failing afternoon light. Westward the rain was already sheeting skyline. Why, the story this gentleman has just told us, retorted Mr. Pounceby. Mr. Gullen looked about him with a perplexed frown and stared very hard at his friend. What the dickens do you mean? He demanded in bewilderment. What story? What gentleman? Mr. Pounceby glanced sharply to his right, stopped dead, and remained as rigid as if he had just awoken from a nightmare. His mouth sagged open, his skin turned the colour of chalk. My God! He exclaimed, and again slowly, almost in a whisper, My God! He wheeled round and peered up the dim perspective of the lane. Beside the signpost, which stood gauntly against the dado of pale clouds, was a man, an indistinct but recognisable figure, swiping with a stick at the long grass. An hour later, the two of them were in the pub at Felday and had related their experience to the barman. Mr. Pounceby was still considerably shaken. Outside, the rain was sousing every inch of ground, and mists had descended as if to hold unholy communion with the deep, cold lake among the pines. Grindlay, said the barman, and spelt it out. Mr. Oliver Grindlay, that's who it was. It's a mercy he'd gone when you went back. Why? Because that story about him and the dog is true, every word. It turned him up pretty bad. He's never been the same since. If he knew that something of the sort had happened again today... We don't talk about it much in these parts. It was Grindlay, you know, who murdered James Coulter's wife and had Coulter hanged for it on that spot where the signpost is now. That's another queer thing. The way Mr. Grindlay is always up alone by that signpost seems to sort of fascinate him. You can't explain these things, though, and it's my belief that it's wisest not to think about them. But there's some that would like to know, though they don't care to hang about Gibbet Lane and find out, said the barman, slowly. And just what that dog saw of his saw, which sent him hell for leather back home, pretty near stark mad with fear. Mr. Pounceby, who was paler than usual, glanced at his own blurred reflection in the dark, rain-slashed window. I shouldn't, he said, and ordered 2 more double whiskies. Gibbet Lane by Anthony Gibbons. Another little tangly little story there. What did you think? Did it give you what it needed to give you? Don't know much about it either. I went looking for it. 1935, I think it was written. So those little comments about Noel Coward would be of a time. Trying to find author Anthony Gittins. There isn't much. He only wrote 2 things. 2, it seems. The Third Performance in 1933, and Gibbet Lane in 1935. Yeah, that is exactly right. Somebody called Gollum. You rested your eyes. Good, I like that. Gittins and Gibbets and Gollum. That's all you need to know. The Evening Standard Book of Strange Stories, 1935. Price 3 and 6pence. 1,024 pages. Oh, hello. Oh, there's lots of lovely stories in here. Oh, I might have to keep hold of that one. The Strange Case of Mr. Todmorden. I don't know if it's not downloadable. There's a few recognisable ones in it. This is 1933. This was published. No, 35, I think. So, was it haunted by the murderer or the hanged man? I think the murderer. Or the murdered wife. Not the murdered wife. No. But I think everybody was dead. Don't you? What about the dog? What happened to the dog? Does anybody care about the dog? No. So is it Gibbet or Gibbet? I don't know. I think Gibbet. I think it's Gibbet. And I thought a gibbet was the metal casing. You know, when they put them in afterwards. I don't know enough about those kind of behaviours, so I do know that there is a gibbet still remaining in the town hall of Rye in Sussex, and apparently the last inhabitant's skull is still partially part of it. I always wanted to see it when I was a kid, but I think it's I don't know. I mean, we were much less queasy about things. Parts of dead bodies in the past. Quite rightly, we're a bit more respectful. It's a gallows, pronounced like giblets. Yes, a gibbet. But I thought was so gibbet. Funny enough, now it's a gallows. There you go. Hang up a body. A gibbet is any instrument of public execution, including guillotine, executioner's block, impalement stake, hanging gallows. Oh, it just covers all the bases. Or related scaffold. Gibbeting is the use of a gallows-type structure from which the dead or dying bodies of criminals were hanged on public display to deter. And the image that I shared for tonight's little video was of Kidd, Captain Kidd the pirate. Let me just find. I need to find this gibbet in Rye. The skull of notorious Rye killer could be displayed. 2013. John Bread's Rye killer. Oh, I need to know this. There's a website called Executed Today. It's not my cup of tea, this. Do you want me to read this? I'll give you a choice. Gibbet Hill, Godalming. We could make our own map quiz. Wonderful. Like in The Handmaid's Tale. I've only read it. I don't remember it. I've never watched it. Yes, please. So, 1743, John Bread's Rye Killer. On this day in 1743, June the 8th, this is, John Bread's met his fate on the gallows in a small Sussex town of Rye on the south coast of England, one of my favourite little towns. The spectacle of his hanging was compounded by the subsequent use of the gibbet, a cage in which Bread's body was left exposed to the elements in Gibbet's Marsh for more than 20 years. On the face of it, this was just another hanging in the dustbin of history, but author Paul Kleber-Monod uses it as a focal point of the book The Murder of Mr. Greeble, Madness and Civility in an English Town, in which he wraps Rye, the murder and the execution, into the social structures of England, especially small town of England of the 18th century. Although the murder itself is a small part of Monod's book, he nonetheless outlines two aspects of the Bread story which make it worth a look by readers of Executed Today. There's a website called Executed Today. Oh, this is so wrong. One, the issue of fairness in the handling of trial and execution, and two, the killer's attempt to assert mental distraction. The facts of the murder itself seem fairly straightforward, although a little quirky, since the whole affair was apparently a case of mistaken identity. James Lamb, the then mayor of Rye, was invited to dinner on March the 16th, 1743, to celebrate the appointment of his son John to the customs service. Lamb was feeling ill that day and asked his brother-in-law, Alan Greeble, to attend the dinner in his place. As Greeble, I think it'd be Greeble, was returning home after the event, he was attacked and stabbed in the churchyard, beautiful churchyard, by John Breads. Though Greeble was able to make it back to his home, he died that night from his wounds. When Breads was arrested for the murder, he claimed he had intended to kill Lamb, not Griebel. Monod points out that, since Lamb was related, albeit by marriage, to the victim, normal procedure would have been to move any hearing or trial to another jurisdiction, or at least allow an independent jurist to preside over the case. Bread's assertion that Lamb was the intended victim should have given the mayor even more reason not to be involved. Instead, he insisted on keeping the trial in Rye and compounded the irregularity by acting as both prosecutor for the grand jury and as judge for the trial, thus ignoring judicial standards relating to a conflict of interest. Additionally, one description of the trial claims that Lamb testified during the trial itself, if this is true. Monod says such testimony was a breach of common law which dictated that judges could not testify in cases over which they were presiding. There you go, and it goes on. I'll give you a link. Hello, Pablo. Execution fans. You can sign up to Executed today. I don't get it. It's like, and no shade on you if it's your thing, you know, if all of the murder podcasts and such business. Lots of details there. Lots of links to lots of other executions. No. John Breads, though. What a name. Breads. I like true crime at times, but I wouldn't say I'm a fan of execution. Well, lots of true crimes stories are about, you know, murders and executions. Say no shade. No shade. Shall we have a look at this? I can read in a dark, dark room. And other scary stories. So first of all, thank you to Katie again. Katie posted a TikTok from Book Talk, an American one, about how the stories in these books were still traumatizing. I immediately bought a copy from eBay. Oh, Dan. Hello, Dan. So this is a classic American book, but this is a re-edition. So this is from 1984. And this is a 2017 re-edition. And I've got to say, the illustrations are incredible. The re-illustrated version. I didn't give you a content warning there for a dead man, did I? And there are 7 stories. The Teeth in the Graveyard. The Green Ribbon, which was the content of the TikTok. In a Dark, Dark Room. Oh, we all know it. We can say it together. The Night It Rained. The Pirate. The Ghost of John. And a little bit about where the stories come from. And again, just incredible illustrations by Victor Rivas. Really detailed. One of those things, one of those books where if you were a kid and you got this, you'd be looking at it again and again and again. And I think they do remind me of the kind of illustrations that were around the ghost stories. LZLZ, are you still awake? If you are, I've got something to tell you. So I'll read you the foreword and then I'll read you a story if you're interested. So the foreword says, and again, aimed at reading with help. So it's a reading scheme. Lure them in with a bit of gruesomeness. Most of us like scary stories because we like feeling scared. when there is no real danger, feeling scared is fun. The best time for these stories is at night, in front of a fire, or in the dark. Tell them slowly and quietly, and everyone will have a good time. Edmund Gorey. I'm not sure. I think it's a reading scheme. So it says here, it's definitely, a reading scheme, definitely lower juniors, isn't it? From Shivering Skeletons, nearly did a skeleton, to Haunted Graveyards. Here are 7 spine-tingling stories to share in the dark, dark room. I think like any of these reading schemes, a lot of them are self-selected. And, anything to hook a reader. And if I wanted to, I would read these. I think I read Roger the Red Pirate. It was tedious. So let's read. I'm going to read to you The Green Ribbon. There was once a girl named Jenny. She was like all the other girls, except for one thing. She always wore a green ribbon around her neck. Oh. There's Jenny. There was a boy named Alfred in her class. Alfred liked Jenny, and Jenny liked Alfred. I was a secondary teacher. One day, he asked her, "Why do you wear that ribbon all the time?" "I cannot tell you," said Jenny. But Alfred kept asking, "Why do you wear it?" And Jenny would say, "It is not important." Jenny and Alfred grew up and fell in love. One day, they got married. After the wedding, if I put that there, I could show you the pictures. After the wedding, Alfred said, "Now that we are married, you must tell me about the green ribbon." "You still must wait," said Jenny. "I will tell you when the right time comes." Years passed. Alfred and Jenny grew old. One day, Jenny became very sick. The doctor told her she was dying. Jenny called Alfred to her side. "Alfred," she said, "now I can tell you about the green ribbon. Untie it, and you will see why I could not tell you before." Slowly and carefully, Alfred untied the ribbon, and Jenny's head fell off. The green ribbon there, from In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories. I love it. Oh, In a Dark, Dark Room. Shall we say it together?